So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce and welcome our speaker today, James Benn, Associate Professor of Buddhism, East Asian Religions, and Chair of the Department of Religious Studies at McMaster University. Professor Benn has wide-ranging expertise in both the Buddhist and Taoist traditions of medieval China. His research and publications thus far have focused on three main areas. These are bodily practices in Chinese religions, the ways in which people create and transmit new religious practices and doctrines, and the religious dimensions of commodity cultures. He is perhaps best known for his book, Burning for the Buddha, a study of the practices and traditions of self-immolation, that is, setting various parts of the body or the entire body on fire in Chinese Buddhism. And he's now completing a book-length manuscript on the religious and cultural history of tea in China. Now, I had originally assumed that this intellectual progression from setting yourself on fire to sipping green tea somehow reflected his own progression from untenured to tenured faculty. But he has assured me that this is not the case and that this is an interest that actually predates his subsequent work. So this is a topic of deep and abiding interest that is finally coming to fruition, and we're very fortunate today to get a sneak peek at this research in a talk entitled Tea and Other Decoctions for Nourishing Life in Medieval China. Please join me in welcoming James Benn.
All right. Thank you very much, Ben, for that very generous introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a real delight to see so many of you here, and it's a great pleasure to be here to talk about my research in front of such an informed and attentive audience. I've never been to University of Michigan before, so I'd like to thank all of those who worked so hard to get me here. And I'm also happy to acknowledge the support of the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. SHUC, as we know it in Canada, always likes to be acknowledged for their support for research. So if there are any spies from SHUC in the audience, you can report back to headquarters that I have in fact done so. So I'm going to talk to you today about one aspect of my research on the religious and cultural aspects of tea in China. And as Ben's just indicated to you, this is part of a book that's going to appear from University of Hawaii Press at some point in the near future. And even as we speak, the manuscript is approaching completion. It's not quite in its final form. So I'm delighted to incorporate any feedback that I get from you here today. So it might be easiest to position today's talk within the larger project just by looking at the table of contents for the book. And much of what I'm going to talk about comes from chapter 6 of the book. So you can see within the context of the book that I've done a lot of positioning of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today. So I'm only going to mention in passing other portions of the project. So when I began this project many years ago now, as Ben indicated, this was something that I worked on before I got into self-immolation. This project had a central thesis that the move away from consuming alcohol towards consuming tea was a major cultural shift in Chinese history, and that religious ideas, religious institutions, and religious individuals played a significant role in that shift. So that was the central thesis. And there's a fair amount of evidence in the contemporary sources that supports this thesis, and I'll just allude to a couple of those examples that I've discussed in more detail elsewhere. So the first of these is a piece of anecdotal evidence for connections between Buddhism and tea. So this is a mid-Tang-dynasty account of the rapid rise in tea drinking, attributing the spread of the custom to a specific monk called Zhang the Demon Queller. And Zhang the Demon Queller is a real historical figure, despite his somewhat picturesque name. I'm not going to read this slide out to you, but it just indicates some of these connections. And the second piece of evidence I want to talk about today is, or mention today, is a discussion between tea and alcohol. This is a text which survives only as a manuscript from Dunhuang, and I'm going to give you, so this is what the manuscript itself looks like. It's very readable, actually. It's very convenient. And this is an excerpt from it. which I hope will allow you perhaps to appreciate the liveliness of the competition between Mr. Tea and Mr. Alcohol. Sometimes when I present on this, I actually act out the roles of Mr. Tea and Mr. Alcohol, but I haven't got time to do that today. I just want you to note the multiple roles that Buddhism plays in the life of Mr. Tea, and in particular note Mr. Tea's claim that tea is drunk by monastics because it clears away their dullness and their weariness. So some of these features of tea are going to be relevant for today's talk. However, this rather charming view of tea and alcohol as two battling beverages, with Buddhism and to a lesser extent Taoism weighing in on the side of tea, is now complicated by the fact that tea was not the only beverage in Tang and Sung China. So in short, it's become increasingly clear that beverage culture was a good deal more diverse than we'd imagined. So to do justice to the story of tea, we need to look not just at Mr. Tea's opponent and rival, Mr. Alcohol, but we also need to look at some of his more closer relatives, to other drinks that might be consumed by monks and others in order to clear away dullness and weariness. So what I want to do today then is to give a better account of this crucial phase in beverage history, which unfolded over a period of about 450 years, from around 750 Common Era to about 1200. So much of the evidence I'm going to talk about today is taken from the textual sources. I'm going to talk about anecdotal collections, I'm going to talk about materia medica, and in particular I'm going to refer to the rules and regulations of Chan Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism. But all of the evidence has wider implications for understanding medieval society and culture, and I'm going to note also some evidence from art history and archaeology, but just in passing today. So appreciating how and why tea and other beverages were consumed is important for medical history, it's important for urban history, and it's important for the cultural and religious history of China. And it may even shed some light on what we drink today and why we drink it. So for these reasons, it's important to understand exactly what our sources are telling us. And I'm going to point out how one particular source and one particular term in that source has perhaps been misunderstood. So if you're all with me so far, I'm going to see if I can briefly summarize the history of tea up until medieval times, which is the time I want to talk about. So despite claims to great antiquity for the regular consumption of beverages made from the leaves of Camellia sinensis, or the tea plant, in early times tea was mostly just drunk sporadically and locally in southwest China, where the tea plant first grew wild. Tea did not appear on the empire-wide stage until the mid-8th century, and I've given you already a piece of evidence to indicate that, after which it rapidly became a very popular drink indeed at all levels of society. Now, for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to present more or less a contemporary account of the rise of tea that gives an abbreviated history of the drink that we can largely confirm from other sources. So this is a mid-9th century source. Tea. Its consumption was unheard of in antiquity. In recent times, it was only by Jin and after Sung that people from Wu picked its leaves to be brewed and made tea congee. By the reign periods of Kaiyuan, Tianbao, tea gradually appeared, but it was only by Zhide and Dali periods that it became abundant, and it became popular only after the Jianzhong period. So this is typical of the mass of textual evidence from the 8th and 9th century that attests to the rapid adoption of tea drinking throughout the Tang Empire, where previously tea had been confined to the south. So you'll see that tea congee, and that is a kind of rice porridge made with the addition of tea leaves, is specifically noted. And this was a food that was often recommended by medical writers of the Tang and later. It shows that tea was not just a drink. It could be consumed in other ways. So to make sense of some of the material I'm going to present in this talk, you'll need to know that methods for the preparation and consumption of tea as a drink had changed over time. So very crudely speaking, the process of making tea has evolved from boiling fresh leaves in water, as seems to have been done in earliest times, to boiling processed tea leaves in cake or loose form. This happened roughly Han Dynasty through to the Tang Dynasty. During the Tang itself, dried tea leaves were pressed into molds to form cakes. The cakes were roasted and they were ground before being infused with boiling water, and sometimes other ingredients would be added to that mixture. So you would have citrus peel, ginger, salt thrown in with your tea as well. In Sung times, cake tea was ground to a fine powder to which boiling water was added, and then the mixture was whisked up with a whisk to a froth, and the result would be a milky-looking liquid with a head of froth that was highly prized by connoisseurs. And it's really only from the Ming Dynasty onwards that we get loose tea steeped in boiling water in a way that's kind of familiar to us today. So what I want to impress upon you is that a cup of tea was by no means a stable thing. It was a substance, a drink that looked, smelled, and tasted quite different depending on when and where it was made. So while today green tea is universally lauded for its antioxidant and other health-giving properties, the beverage was not always uncritically recommended in medieval China. An anecdotal collection, New Tales of the Great Tang, informs us that the Right Rectifier of Omissions, Wu Jiong, wrote a preface against the drinking of tea sometime during the Kaiyuan period. Although that work sadly no longer survives, a great shame, an abstract does survive, which begins thus. Tea cleans out what is stagnant or blocked up, but the benefit lasts only for a single day and is only temporary. It weakens the qi and violates the essence, so that the accumulation of harm to the body is indeed great. If people obtain any improvement in their health, they attribute it to the power of tea. But if there is some misfortune, they don't say it's the fault of the tea. Isn't it rather that when good fortune is close at hand, it is easy to realize it, but when ill fortune is far off, it is hard to see it? And in the discussion of tea and alcohol, which I showed you earlier, Mr. Alcohol makes a similar claim about the danger of tea drinking. Mr. Alcohol says, "To drink tea is only to get backache. If one drinks too much, one will be sick to the stomach. If one drinks 10 cups in a single day, one's intestines will be like a drum. If one were to drink it for 3 years, one would certainly be repaid with the appearance of a frog with abdominal dropsy." So there you are. Harsh words from Mr. Alcohol about the dangers of consuming tea. A frog with abdominal dropsy. Doesn't sound appealing. So these are by no means the only texts to caution against drinking tea to excess, but they will serve as a good counterpoint to what I'm talking about today. And what I'm talking about today is the place of tea alongside other health and wellness promoting beverages. So in my talk today, I'm going to discuss a class of hot drinks that I'm going to refer to as decoctions. Now, this term is not precisely correct in all cases, since not all the ingredients were decocted. They weren't all boiled to produce their ingredients. But I think the word will give something of the flavor of how these herbal drinks and tonics were made and how they were regarded in medieval times. So in my talk today, I'm going to try and pay attention to the following questions about these decoctions of Tang. What was in them? Where were they served in terms of location? Were they served in tea houses? Were they served in the monastery? When were they served? Both time of day, when were they served ritually speaking? What season were they served in? And who drank them? So in my larger project, I attempt to highlight the vital importance of Chinese Buddhist monasteries in the development of tea culture. Apart from growing and processing tea on monastery land, monasteries were important sites in the development of modes of tea consumption. But of course, I'm hardly the first person to have noticed this. The great Japanese scholar monk Mujaku Dochu long ago noted the significant role played by Buddhist monasteries in the development of tea culture. His lexicon of Zen monastic terminology, Notes on the Utensils for Zen Monasteries, contains an important entry on sare, tea ritual or tea ceremony. The cognate term, chali, is not attested in Chinese sources prior to the Chan Buddhist materials dating to the Sung dynasty, and we may assume that any specific ritual for the consumption of tea in monasteries is not much earlier than the 10th century. The invention of Buddhist tea ritual offers an interesting example of a creation of a religious ritual for social, cultural, material reasons, and not so much for doctrinal ones. There was no overwhelming doctrinal need for a tea ritual, but there were many social reasons for its necessity. But to understand the place of tea drinking in the Buddhist monastery and in society more generally, we need to widen our scope so as to comprehend Tang and Sung dynasty beverage culture as a whole. While it's possible to consider tea mostly in opposition to alcohol, as in the Dunhuang text, A Discussion Between Tea and Alcohol, that I showed you earlier, by the 9th and 10th centuries, people had a much wider range of drinks than tea or alcohol from which to choose. And there was a particular enthusiasm at all levels of society for beverages made of aromatic, herbal substances that had medicinal qualities, what we might call health drinks, but which I'm going to call decoctions. Now, we can best understand this interest in medical decoctions as part of a larger vogue for medicine as food, or dietetics, which was current in Sung dynasty times. To understand the cultural and religious significance of tea, then, we have to consider it in the context of this wider beverage culture and this vogue for consuming herbal preparations for nourishing life. If people wanted an alternative to alcohol, tea was not the only choice. So what kinds of decoctions, broths, and juices did people ingest in late medieval, early modern China? Well, let's begin with an example of a health drink that was already known in Tang times. So this is a recipe for a chilled tisane made from hujang, a tiger stick or giant knotweed. And it says, in the summer months, it is decocted with licorice. The colour is a delightful shade of amber, pleasing to the eye, and the taste is sweet and delicious. It is bottled and put to chill in a well until ice cold. It is then decanted into white porcelain or silver vessels and drunk as a beverage like tea. People nowadays call this cold beverage and rate it more highly than tea. Well, I think you can tell from the description that this is not a common person's beverage. The emphasis on the aesthetic quality of the drink and the pricey utensils with which it was served shows that it was much more likely to have been consumed by the elite. Giant knotweed, whose tender shoots can be eaten like asparagus, was by no means a random choice for this decoction. It was and is employed in the Chinese pharmaca to combat high fevers, agitation and distress, to quench thirst, as a diuretic, and to expel all kinds of toxins associated with heat. But this recipe is in fact not for the kind of herbal drug that might be prepared and administered in controlled doses by a supervising doctor. Rather, this is a much more dilute preparation that can be drunk at will in the summertime, just like tea. Because of this mode of enjoying pharmacologically active ingredients in relatively small and uncontrolled doses, it may be helpful to compare this and other decoctions to the kind of health drinks or sports drinks that we consume today. Tea was noted for its medicinal qualities and particularly favoured by Buddhist monks because it aided with digestion, increased concentration, and reduced the need to sleep. These qualities were seen as particularly beneficial to practitioners of meditation. In addition to this giant knotweed tisane that we're looking at here, other medicinal beverages in Tang times were explicitly described as alternatives to tea, and some were specifically aimed at monastic consumers. The 8th century Essential Secrets of the Imperial Library by Wang Tao contains a new recipe for a tea substitute. It consists of 14 ingredients ground to a powder and prepared as a decoction. The description tells us it is particularly recommended for eminent scholars of Chan, or meditation. It frees the internal organs and regulates the blood vessels. Just a little brings great benefits, conferring inexhaustible mental vigor. It is especially effective when drunk to satiety. Wang Tao's description of this tea substitute sounds a little bit like the 8th century equivalent of Red Bull gives you wings, with an indication of niche marketing towards practitioners of meditation. This recipe, although it was more of a medicinal decoction and less a popular beverage, shows that tea and other health drinks were sought out by practitioners of meditation for their ability to sustain an attentive mind in a healthy body. This recipe and those of other tea substitutes used in Tang times may have had similar physiological effects as tea, but certainly they tasted quite different. The licorice that was in most of these recipes made these drinks much sweeter than tea. Now, lest we find it strange that monks would be interested in such worldly concerns, or perhaps reluctant to use performance-enhancing aids to meditation, there is in fact plenty of contemporary evidence for an interest in health drinks in the Buddhist monastery. For example, Robert Buswell, in his Zen monastic experience, reports widespread use by Korean monks of Chinese herbal medicines designed to increase stamina, along with other health fads such as the consumption of powdered pine needles, or a particularly unpleasant health drink that he describes in his time, made of scrap iron oxidized in water and called iron water. He describes how monks gave up drinking that after outbreaks of chronic diarrhea in the monastery. Anyway, as we'll see, in medieval times, the use of medicinal decoctions within the monastery was so common as to become standardized. Now, while medicinal beverages and health drinks were known in Tang times, they were consumed rather differently in the Sung, where they were obliged to compete with tea in the open urban market. Anecdotal collections abound with examples of the commercialization of tea and other drinks, especially in the cities. In the northern Sung capital of Kaifeng, we are told the vendors of drugs and beverages call out their wares with all kinds of patter. While in the southern Sung capital of Hangzhou, then called Linan, we are told there are breakfast stalls selling medicinal decoctions like urchin tang, and pills and concoctions for regulating qi, bringing down retrograde qi, and settling and nourishing original qi. Urchin tang was a typical medicinal decoction in Sung times and is still drunk today. Its ingredients were dried tangerine peel, root of Pinellia, which is one of the most important herbs in Chinese medicine, used to dry up coughing, dry up phlegm, prevent coughing, prevent nausea, prevent vomiting, and fuling, or Poria cocos, a fungus widely used today to strengthen the spleen and increase vitality. And of course, licorice, to provide the necessary sweetness and flavor and to make all these drinks palatable. So to give you an idea of the range of medicinal decoctions available to consumers by the 11th century, say, some 26 prescriptions for various kinds of decoctions are listed in the prescriptions of the Taiping era Pharmacy for the Welfare of the People, dated to 1107. So decoctions include those made of cardamom, Banksia rose, sweet osmanthus, peppermint, perilla, jujube, magnolia bark, apricot frost, sounds delightful that one, fresh ginger, black cardamom, fennel, as well as decoctions with more descriptive names such as breaking qi or 5 flavors. And from other sources we know that decoctions of fuling, which I already mentioned, red arrow, astragalus, ginseng, sweet bean, and even sometimes minerals like mica were popular. As we've already noted, licorice was a key ingredient in many of the recipes for these beverages. Although the recipes were quite different in terms of ingredients, they were clearly designed to be both aromatic, they smelled nice, and tasty. They were designed to be palatable. But if such decoctions were to compete with tea and alcohol, they had to be easy to make and they had to be easy to drink. Medicinal decoctions in Sung times were sold as pre-packaged instant drinks, consisting of about 5 grams or 1 spoonful of powdered ingredients in a little paper package to which boiling water was added. So, the method of preparation for decoctions was very similar to that of tea, which in Sung times was also finely powdered, whisked up with boiling water, poured in a thin stream from a metalware ewer. If we look at the intended physiological effects of the decoctions, we will see that most of the medicinal ingredients, Banksia rose, cloves, sandalwood, turmeric, etc., were classified as drugs that regulated qi and strengthened the spleen viscera, or they were thought to strengthen qi in the lungs viscera and aid with digestion. Tea, on the other hand, was classified in the Materia Medica as a substance that was diuretic, aided digestion, increased concentration, and reduced the need for sleep. So physiologically, we can consider tea and decoctions as complementary in their effect. Sung dynasty city dwellers varied the beverages they drank according to the season. In the tea shops in Lennan, we are told, powdered tea or decoctions were sold in the wintertime, while plum blossom liquor was sold during the summertime. In addition to medicinal decoctions, many other kinds of refreshing beverages were sold, including sweet bean soup, coconut wine, pear syrup, stewed plum juice, honey water, papaya water, and of course tea. But just as contemporary medical writers may inveigh against the dangers of consuming too many health drinks, especially for our students, Sung medics also wrote about the perils of abusing medicinal decoctions. Ko Zung-shi, a famous pharmacologist of the 11th and 12th century, warns against the dangers of perilla, which many people enjoy taking unregulated almost on a daily basis. Perilla was understood to invigorate both the spleen and the lungs viscera. He writes, "It can be used in powder form and has a fragrant odor. Encouraging people to drink it as a decoction from morning to night is not salutary. Doctors believe that fragrant herbs are a cause of illness among the rich and powerful. They produce cold in the spleen and stomach, and if taken to excess, cause chronic diarrhea, often without the individual realizing." Eventually, warnings such as this by medical men, along with the cost of certain ingredients, brought an end to the craze for medicinal decoctions. Although some continue to be drunk, even today, it was tea that was allowed to continue as the Chinese health drink par excellence. Comestibles in China often played multiple roles, and tea, like alcohol, was used not just for drinking. It could also be employed to make religious offerings, and we see a similar modality for medicinal decoctions. According to the Dream of the Splendors of the Eastern Capital, on the 8th day of the 4th lunar month, which is the birthday of the Buddha, the ceremony of washing the Buddha was held at 10 major temples. A syrupy decoction of fragrant herbs was boiled up and passed around. This was known as water for washing the Buddha. So like alcohol and tea then, medicinal decoctions could serve an important ritual function. This aspect of their use demands that we consider them as significant, culturally meaningful part of the larger world of Tang-sung beverages and comestibles. So, it is against this background of an interest in dietetics and a craze for health-giving beverages that we have to understand tea culture in the Sung dynasty. The situation is particularly acute within the Buddhist monastery, where we find regulations for the formal consumption of tea and medicinal decoctions side by side. Unfortunately, this dialectic between tea and decoctions has been hard to spot because we have not always understood the meaning of the term tang in our text, or decoction. As we've seen already, tang was commonly used in Sung sources to designate a herbal decoction. However, in her important English translation of a major Chinese Buddhist monastic code, Tanyuan Qinggui, the Pure Rules for Chan Monasteries, Venerable Ifa, a distinguished scholar of Chinese Buddhism who is herself a nun, translates Tang as sweetened drink. In doing so, she follows the Tang monk I Ching's travel diary, here, recording Indian monastic customs of offering honey, ghee, and the 8 syrups. Now, in fact, sweetened drink is not even an accurate translation for what I Ching is talking about, because not all of these Indian syrups are sweet in taste. And in any case, as we have seen, at the time Tanyuan Qinggui was written, Tang clearly referred to medicinal decoctions. And there was a prescribed monastic ritual for the serving and drinking of those decoctions in the monastery, just as there was for tea. As Morton Schluter has argued, Sung monastic institutions were acutely aware of the patronage games that they were obliged to play with state and local elites. The attention devoted to hosting literati by abbots using tea offers a practical example of how that awareness played out. But the insistence on correct etiquette and decorum in the serving of tea and medicinal decoctions permeated even relationships within the monastery among monks. When a wandering monk arrived at a Chan monastery for a temporary visit, he was required to present himself at the office of the chief monk. The chief monk would receive him and serve him tea. According to the monastic regulations, the travelling monastic should present his official monastic certificate, and the chief monk would respond by apologising to the travelling monastic for any lack of hospitality. The regulations note explicitly that no decoction was to be served at this time. Rather, the chief monk should simply show the visitor to the monk's hall and arrange a space for him based on his level of seniority. Now, although at first this piece of data may seem entirely inconsequential, in fact it offers an important clue that large public monasteries followed secular etiquette in observing a custom of tea first, decoction later. The theory behind this protocol was that when a guest arrives, he should be welcomed with tea. Before he leaves, because his mouth may be dry from chatting, he should be presented with a bowl of tonic decoction to relieve his weariness. Seems reasonable. So now I'm going to show you some, is it possible to get the lights down even further for this? I'm not sure these will show up very well. I don't really have a lot of time to talk about these images today, but it would be nice to see them a little bit more clearly. So as you can see, these are some hanging scrolls dated about 1178. And they show the disciples of the Buddha, the arhats, but they obviously represent kind of, yeah, that's great. They obviously represent more kind of contemporary monastic practice in the serving of tea. So here we see monks or arhats, and they've got their tea powder is in their bowls here that they're holding, and then the monastic servant is pouring a thin stream of boiling water from a ewer into those bowls. So that really represents the kind of way that tea would have been served in the monastery. This just shows the kind of tea connoisseurship that would have gone on, or was imagined to have gone on in a monastery. These hanging scrolls originally were commissioned for a monastery and hung in a monastery. So this is not kind of a literati view of monastic life. This is a monk's view of monastic life. So you can see the arhats gathered around this convenient rock, which is shaped just like a tea table. How convenient. And over here you can see that they have the teacups, and they have kind of wrapped up cakes of tea. And then in the third one, there's some very interesting details on this, very hard to see in this version. But the monastic servant here is gathering water from a mountain stream, which is the best kind of water for drinking tea. And then these two figures down here that you can just make out, two demonic figures. This guy here is kind of tending the brazier. That would have been used to roast the tea and then break it up, and also to heat the water on. And then this little figure here is using a tea grinder to grind the tea cake into a fine powder. And on the bigger version of the image, you can actually see that he has a tea whisk there. So all the implements match exactly how they're described. So this is kind of important art historical evidence I don't have a lot of time to talk about today, but it just gives you some sense of what's going on. And they would have hung together like this at some point. So This is an earlier version of a monastic tea ceremony. The date of this painting isn't anything like as early as it's attributed. It's attributed to an artist who died in 673, but this painting can't possibly be that early. It's probably 10th century, and it shows a scene in a monastery. The two monastic servants here are preparing and making tea in an earlier fashion. So they're boiling up tea on a brazier, possibly with other ingredients in it. I'll show you a detail. I'm sorry about the quality of this electronic reproduction. It's just impossible to get a better... The painting itself is not in great condition, and it's impossible to get a better electronic reproduction. This is the one from the Gugong that they actually sent me. So this is the best one the Palace Museum has available. But you can see there these two monastic servants heating up the tea over the brazier there. Okay, so we already mentioned the Sung dynasty method for making tea by pointing tea. That's the technical term that's used, dian cha, a thin stream of hot water into powdered tea. And this same method was the one employed in Chan monasteries for making both tea and decoctions. There are many references to pointing tea in the monastic codes of Sung dynasty Chan monasteries because their authors were careful to prescribe exactly how monastic tea ceremonies, often held to host visiting officials, should be staged. Although this method of pointing tea was ubiquitous in Buddhist monasteries, one still finds ample references in the literature to other forms of tea making, such as I just showed you, boiling tea, jian cha. Tea was also consumed in the monastery in the form of tea gruel, tea congee, or as an ingredient in a medicinal soup. But it seems that the specificity of the method of pointing tea in monastic ceremonies was intended to ensure an egalitarian aspect in which all the monks drank the same tea. That was the important principle. The monastic regulations, in fact, specify that when a monastic tea ceremony is held, monks were not to use their own stores of powdered tea. They had to use communal stores. So the method of making decoctions is very similar to that of tea. The drugs are crushed to a powder to which boiling water is added. And a story in the early Sung collection, Taiping Guangji, about the Tang physician Sun Miao offers explicit evidence of this when he carefully instructs a monastic servant to prepare a medicinal decoction in the same manner as tea. So our confusion about the terminology for tea and decoctions and their preparation and serving in the Sung dynasty monastic codes has obscured our view of the extent to which tea and decoctions were both important ritually and socially in Buddhist monasteries and beyond. The term jian dian, boiling and pointing, used throughout the monastic codes, this one here, can indicate pointing tea or pointing decoctions or both simultaneously, but scholars have interpreted this term differently, some claiming that it refers to tea and snacks, so seeing this dian in it, like dim sum. Venerable Ifar's rendering of jian dian and cha tang as formal tea ceremony and lesser tea ceremony is particularly misleading because, as we've seen, protocol specifies the serving of tea on arriving and decoction on leaving in both secular and monastic contexts. The Pure Rules for Chan monasteries itself specifies that ritual is required for both tea and decoctions. The monastic tea ceremony was essentially no different from its counterpart decoction ceremony, just as tea and decoctions were consumed according to the seasons in the secular world. So the Pure Rules for Chan monastery instructs the abbot's attendant, make tea or decoctions each in accordance with the season. The abbreviated rules of purity for small monasteries, compiled by the Japanese scholar monk Mujaku Dochu in 1684 on the basis of Chinese exemplars, contains this image. I don't have a better version of it. Unfortunately, this is, rather poorly printed, but this is an image I think you can see of a decoction cup. Here's the cup and the spoon and the stand that it stands on. And below that, the passage describes the ingredients that are put in the decoction. This one's got, tangerine peel and Banksia rose and things like that in it. The same text also has an entry for a decoction ceremony. And in an excavation from a Liao dynasty tomb at Chifeng, dating to 959, you can see a silver bowl, a saucer, and a spoon that look very similar to the kind of thing that Mujaku illustrates. Little did I think that in 2012 I would still be showing images out of Wunwu from 1956, these terrible black and white awful images that you used to get in the 80s. But anyway, that was the best one I can find, that it shows the shape of the thing. And there are probably a lot more of these decoction cups found archaeologically that haven't been really identified as such. You need to find the spoon with it to kind of really indicate what the thing is. Like tea, decoctions were used not just for drinking. As we've already seen, in lay practice, medicinal decoctions could be used as Buddhist offerings in the same way as tea. According to the abbreviated rules of purity for small monasteries, on the anniversary of the Buddha's nirvana, 15th day, second lunar month, one should offer tea, fruit, and medicinal decoctions to the Buddha. The text gives quite a detailed description of how the offering is to be made. Tea and medicinal decoctions were often offered to pilgrims in the form of Buddhist charity, and there were lay associations that formed exclusively to perform this role. What kinds of decoctions were popular in the monastery? Well, from references that we find in the Sung dynasty biographies of eminent monks, it was decoctions made of tangerine peel or mountain yam that were the decoctions of choice for many Buddhist monks. In the late 10th century, I'll just give you one example. In the late 10th century, the monk Wuan of the Seguang Chapel in Hangzhou was particularly strict with his disciples. And in particular, they were not allowed to eat any food after noon. One of his poor disciples was caught drinking mountain yam decoction and was forced to leave the monastery. So very strict then. It seems then that for some Buddhist monks, these decoctions counted as food, not to be consumed after noon, and not medicine. So while tea and medicinal decoctions were formally balanced within the monastic diet, sometimes the two beverages were combined. The Sung dynasty compendium of Taoist texts, 7 slips from a cloudy satchel. In an entry devoted to consuming pneuma, consuming qi, and abstaining from grain, says, if a decoction medicine is required, then apricot, ginger and honey in good tea from shu will do no harm. If one's strength is not perfect, it is appropriate to use this to balance and strengthen the body. So this recipe shows that tea remained well integrated into the repertoire of herbal tonics. And with that bringing together of tea and decoctions, I'm going to conclude this brief survey and just move to a conclusion. So I hope that I've shown today the value of looking at a multiplicity of sources and investigating urban society and monastic life side by side. The picture that emerges from this study is of a more complex development for the story of the rise of tea than we'd previously imagined. And what have we learned from this? Well, we need to pay attention to multiple sources from different genres in order to build up a picture of a culture or to follow the story of a commodity. The story of tea and medicinal decoctions in particular needs to be traced across materia medica, occasional prose, anecdotal collections, gazetteers, Taoist encyclopedias, Buddhist monastic regulations. In particular, we need to read our sources against all the other evidence, including art historical and archaeological. We will go astray, in particular, if we try and understand Buddhist texts using only other Buddhist texts to guide us. When the Pure Rules for Chan Monasteries was written, our author knew that Tang referred to medicinal decoction. It did not refer to a syrup or to a sweetened drink. But we would be hard-pressed to find the term defined that way elsewhere in the Buddhist canon. Understanding how and why people consumed certain substances is very important for understanding social and cultural history. I hope I've shown today that the history of China's national beverage is intertwined with the story of other substances in interesting and perhaps unexpected ways. Thank you very much for your kind attention.